Can you all hear me? We are the English panel. Es tut mir leid, but thank you so much for saying. We're going to talk about global expansion. So I have an amazing panel of global marketing experts, and we are going to talk about what we have learned, what we are seeing, and some advice that we can share with all of you about how to take German brands and businesses to the UK and the US market. I threw a bit of a curveball to my panelists 2 minutes before we walked up here because I said I want to change up how we actually introduce each other because I feel like it's often very much the same thing. So what I asked each of the panelists to think about was, instead of giving their CV and their background, what are the 3 most relevant things about who they are and what they know to the topic of global expansion for German businesses? So I'll go first. I'll give you all another minute to keep thinking about it. 3 things for me. I run a boutique marketing research and consulting firm that focuses on challenger brands. So we've done 10,000 hours of research over the last 4 years trying to understand how disruptors within categories grow when they don't have the budget and the resource to compete. Second thing is, I am American, but I've been based in London for the last 10 years, and I've worked regionally in the UK and EMEA. And the third thing is, I host a CMO podcast and have interviewed about 200 CMOs over the last 5 years. That's me. Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much for this curveball. So my first fun fact is, in the last 18 years, I've been working for US companies in both a international and both an EMEA role. So I'm very used to traversing and championing the ability to get products and capabilities built in for non-US brands. My second fun fact is I have not actually had a European manager in the last 12 years. I've had a manager from Australia, had a manager from Toronto, I've had a manager from Miami, I've had a manager from Boston. Oh, I even had one from Sao Paulo at one point. So again, I'm very used to being able to sort of understand the complexity that comes when working cross-market. My third fun fact is, whilst for the most part most of my career has been working for US companies, for the most part of it, my focus has been on Europe. Not just on the UK, but looking at UK, France, and Germany, and how can we actually bring them to the same level of parity as what's happening within the US. So there you go, multicultural.
Nailed it. John?
Awesome, thank you. How do I follow that? All right, so first of all, good afternoon. It's lovely to be in Hamburg on such a beautiful day. My name's John Tigg. I run advertiser and agency sales for Index Exchange. We're one of the world's largest exchanges, and we have a pretty large presence both here in Hamburg and also in Düsseldorf, and we have a big office in Berlin. Lots of experience in the German market. I guess, 3 things about my role that I think are relevant. Look, first and foremost, my focus is advertisers and agencies, and we're here on Advertisers Day at DreiCon, so I'm hoping that I can bring you some insight from the last 20 years of trying to do this stuff with various advertisers and agencies around the world. Obviously, at the core of everything that we do is data. So that's the second thing. Love to share some insight around how we use data to optimize everything that we do. At the end of the day, we're in the media business, so we work very closely with suppliers, and here more than anywhere else, I think in the world, the sort of distance between demand and supply is shortest. There's a very equitable relationship between buyers and sellers, and I think hopefully I can bring some experience of doing that, and I'll give you one bonus one. It's St. Patrick's Day today. And I am Irish. So I will look forward to sharing a few Guinnesses with you all after we get through the panel. Bring it on. Go Ireland.
Can I just say you don't sound Irish at all?
No, we'll cover that later at the panel. All right?
We're going to have to check.
I've got the passport, actually. I'll show you.
So we bring a little bit of more multicultural. I'm half French, so there's not anything in France today that I'm aware of on the 17th of March. But again, I've kind of been born and raised in the UK, but with that kind of lens of background. My roles have spanned marketing in various companies across kind of like startups and global, but my lens also has been like EMEA or global as well. So I've kind of sat across looking after marketing for digital advertising businesses across multiple markets. That's 2 facts, isn't it? What's the third one? I've forgotten my third one.
2 is good. John did a bonus one. So
Yeah, exactly. It levels out.
You're welcome.
Thanks.
All right. So let's get into it. The app is open for questions. And I always think about, what we're trying to do is add as much value to you all as we can. We've had a prep call. We've thought about what we think is going to be most relevant. But as you get a little bit of context on us and we get into the conversations, you're going to know what's most relevant. So please do submit the questions, and I will try to keep an eye on the app. The way that we thought about framing up this conversation, we had our prep call last week, was, this is a 30-minute conversation to try to give you advice on how to bring a German business to the UK and the US, which can be a career of learning. And so what we decided to do was identify kind of the 3 biggest trends from our perspective right now, which are going to be curation and culture, AI, but specifically AI implementation. And then we're going to talk about new media, the channels that we see coming up that we think are big opportunities in the UK and the US. And then we're going to wrap it up with some very specific, practical tips, tricks, best practices from our experience for you all. And then whatever questions come through, we'll go there. Okay, so we're going to start with curation and culture. So curation being kind of this trend of everybody's putting out so much content. Obviously, technology and AI has lowered the barrier to almost nothing of the production and distribution of content. What does that mean for the brands and the advertisers that are able to actually curate value? And then also culture. From our research, we see one of the big ways that challenger brands grow faster than incumbents within these categories that are being disrupted is they're able to create more, better, faster cultural relevance within these categories to grow. So we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. John, let's start with you. I know you had some thoughts on the topic of curation.
Yeah, thank you. Well, look, I'll start by saying this. I guess our job here is to try to bring as much kind of global market expertise as we can to the audience here. And I'll start by saying, the first and easiest mistake to make is that you can kind of walk into any market and, bring, what you've learned from other markets and just assume that's going to work. I mean, I think, one of the key things is to really take time to understand cultural nuances, to understand the business of advertising in any market before you decide which are sort of the right pieces that fit. And that's certainly the approach that we've always taken. Having said that, there are some kind of themes and kind of big principles that I think transcend some of those cultural nuances, some of those things that make markets what they are from a commercial and trading perspective. And one of the things that we've seen is this kind of this curation thing. Now, this didn't come out of nowhere. 5 years ago, advertisers very clearly asked their agencies, where are my ads running? And I think in a lot of cases, they were not able to give them an answer. And so that led to this first wave of what we called supply path optimization. So tell us where our ads are showing, be transparent about that, tell us the fees that are being charged so that we can understand not just, what the cost is of running advertising in this way, but how do you find impressions that genuinely perform? And so that kind of, that was, I guess, the first wave, and you started to see some consolidation across tech vendors and suppliers that work with agencies to try to find where the quality is and try to avoid unnecessary fees. And then came curation. So how do you go a step further? How do you make sure that you are finding very specific pockets of supply and data that will work for a very specific campaign, a very specific deal that an advertiser is trying to run? And I think, I like to think of curation as, one metaphor that you could think of it is a little bit going to buy a tailored suit. So, if you imagine that you don't wear the same clothes necessarily, or you wouldn't buy the same suit to go to the office as you would for your wedding. And the same theory applies for ad campaigns. They're all different. They have different budgets, they have different measurement, they have different goals. And you need to be very specific about how you're going to achieve those goals. And so what curation does is it allows you to create a bespoke package of supply and data that will work in particular for this advertiser, for this campaign, for this deal. And I think, over the course of, well, certainly the end of 2024 and going into 2025, we saw this go from something that advertisers and their agencies are experimenting with to a core part of the commercial approach that any agency is taking. And so, we've certainly learned a lot along the way, but, I think that that's certainly very relevant to everything that we see that's going on in Germany today.
Can I possibly just add something to that? I think there is definitely looking at this from the demand side. I work for Yahoo DSPs, so very much focused on the buy side. We do see a difference in the way that advertisers approach things in Europe versus how they approach things in the US when it comes to curation. In Europe, when you think about all the tight privacy regulations that we have, and there's a lot less appetite to be able to actually surface data directly into buying platforms, we're seeing a lot more sort of data-led curation taking place, especially within the CTV environment. When you switch across to the US, it's a much different landscape. In that instance, there's a lot more data that's available. And in there, it's more actually about the supply-based packaging. It's about things such as live sports. There's a lot more, supply that's actually available. So actually, there is that need to sort of package it together in a curated way. But for the most part, the data is actually coming from the buy-side platform versus the sell. So it's a slight nuance, and I think that's driven by the privacy regulations that you see in Europe.
So let's bridge that into the cultural conversation. I know you had some thoughts to share on cultural moments, and there's a few questions that have come in, which is great. So I'm going to try to weave these in as we go. Some of them I think will get addressed as we go along.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, I suppose like from an Uber advertising standpoint, I mean, Uber as a business is kind of it was intrinsically woven into people's like everyday habits as the way that we see it. Therefore, like culturally, if people are traveling for work and they need to get to the airport, they can get an Uber. If you're entertaining and you realize you haven't got, the right supplies in the fridge, you can order like a grocery shop and it can be there on the way home. It's kind of like that service and fulfilling that need. So when people are kind of in that need mindset, they're going into the platform and they're in that decision-making mindset. And that's kind of what we're doing as a business, is kind of putting brands at the heart of that decision-making mindset when people are kind of using the platform. And, not only kind of like the first-party data that we have across both the mobility side of our business and the delivery side, but we're also seeing that married with attention. On average, we did a study last year which showed that 6.6 times active attention that we were getting across the ad formats compared to comparable ones. So it's kind of like it's grown very, very quickly over the last few years, but we're seeing great traction.
So I want to throw in a couple questions from the audience because I think they're relevant here. So there's a question about learning the ins and outs of a different country is difficult enough. How do you deal with regional nuances? And I will piggyback that question with another one that asks specifically about dialects. When we talk about curation, we talk about culture. There's the national level, but obviously when you're speaking to a person or an audience, or we've done some research on challenger brands and how they speak to microcultures. When you're speaking to a microculture, that can often be regional specific. So I don't know who wants to jump in on that. Alice?
I'm just going to jump in with one very small comment. And forgive me for anyone who's British in the audience that might disagree with me. I don't think it's as important in the UK. Maybe the North-South divide, maybe. Now, definitely if you're Scottish, very important. But for the most part, I don't think it's as important. When you come across into the US, though, I mean, that's a continent at the end of the day. Yeah. The difference is if you think about how you're engaging with the Spanish Hispanic community, or how people navigate, or how people engage with brands versus if they're from the state of California versus New York, in my interpretation is incredibly incredibly different. And that also transcends across to the types of supply that you're actually tapping into. Sorry to bring CTV up again, but from a CTV perspective, think about all of the regional broadcasters that are available. Think about the fact you really do have, firstly, you have the ability to be able to actually find those niche audiences and find them at scale, but you definitely do have to adjust the way that you're talking. But I don't think it's that important in the UK.
I mean, I think certainly this feels like a use case that's like curation has been made for. I mean, it's all about creating bespoke packages that are going to be, culturally relevant to those groups. And I think by doing an effective job, bringing together the right media with the right data, with the right measurement, that's exactly how you can use tools like that to achieve that aim. And you don't need to take a massively broad approach. And programmatic, historically was known for being like massive scale, massive reach, low prices. And I think where we've got to is actually now you can be really, really precise, and it's less about cost and more about precision. And I think that's a great example of where something like that can be effective.
So speaking about precision, I want to move on to talk about AI implementation. Alice, I know you literally just gave a masterclass on this topic. So why don't we start with you when it comes to actually implementing AI to create value, not kind of the hype innovation theater that's going on in a lot of businesses. What does that look like?
So yesterday morning I had one answer. And since then, I've had a few meetings with German companies, and I've completely changed my tune and completely changed my answer. So when we originally spoke, I really did think that Germany and UK were in the same sort of space when it came to developing out sort of agentic workflows and the stage which they were at when it came to agentic communication. Not going to name any names, but I spoke to an incredibly large German publisher yesterday and also spoke with somebody from within the industry, and both of them are focusing on AdCP. So for those of you who don't know, that's the publisher-based protocol, agentic protocol that allows the ability to sort of streamline communication between the buy and sell side for direct sort of supply purchasing. And both of them separately said the same thing to me, that they are concerned that the German market is waiting for too much governance to come in and too much direction to come in on what to do, that in actual fact, they're coming behind the other markets such as the UK and US, and they're losing the ability to actually influence the direction that these protocols are taking, and hence, in turn, potentially impacting the performance that they might see later on down the line. So I was very surprised by that. What I would say, though, is that both people that I spoke to, their mindset was, we want to do something now. We need to be doing something now. We need to come together as an industry in Germany in order to be driving this transformation forward when it comes to agentic. So that's happening in the UK. That's definitely happening in the US. I'd also argue there are some markets that are well ahead of the curve. I don't know what it is about the Netherlands. They just seem to be ahead of the curve with loads of different things. Maybe it's because they're a smaller market, they're more nimble. It's a case whereby companies are able to do sort of test and learn within there. But if there's anything that I would probably say around agentic and for the German industry, is like, don't wait for permission to do it. Start testing now. Start looking to see what other markets are doing, because I'm telling you right now, the other markets are doing that.
Emily, John, anything to add on that?
Yeah, I mean, the same sentiment, right? I mean, from a retail media standpoint, we've seen that on measurement, the UK and the US haven't sort of, waited for the standards to be set. They're kind of moving fast and kind of like at the forefront, which means that they're kind of creating the standards that the rest of the industry will follow. So, I think it's kind of like move faster and experiment for sure.
Yeah, I think on our side, it's kind of slightly more nuanced. So I'd kind of point towards two areas where we're seeing, a lot of innovation with using AI, which is actually genuinely effective and is having an impact right now. So look, the first one of those is in custom bidding. Now, that's not a new thing by any means. There are various companies that have been providing custom bidding algorithms to advertisers and agencies for a number of years. But the deployment of how that's being done is changing things. And so, the role of an SSP, the role of an exchange in the programmatic supply chain historically has been about managing the scale of the open internet. Making sure that we don't flood DSPs with every impression we see, and actually kind of, in some respects, curating them down. So, a DSP only sees the kinds of impressions it wants. But what that means is that we see a lot of data. We see a lot of data, which is obviously high in volume, but it's high in quality because we're seeing signals that come directly from publishers, and it's very uniform. And because of those things, that lends itself extremely well to being good training data for AI models. And so what we've done is we've allowed a number of custom bidding companies to actually sit on top of our exchange to see all of the data that we see. So it's about 700 billion auctions a day globally, and use that data as a reference to drive better learning for the AI models. And we've seen extraordinary lifts in performance just by exposing those models to that volume of data. So that's kind of one place where we're seeing AI really have an impact as an SSP. On a more practical level, what tends to make the headlines, things that generate videos, things that generate images, don't tend to be the things that actually drive any business. What we found is that when we look at the things that people are doing in our platform every day, it's things that are a bit more mundane. They're troubleshooting deals. They're trying to understand why sometimes DSPs bid and sometimes why they don't bid. And this is taking up vast amounts of people's time. I mean, this is a use case that is tailor-made for AI to understand, okay, what's going on here, and allow a large language model to query that and produce immediate results that avoid the need for things like pivot tables, and avoid the need to make 10, 15 emails out to DSP, SSP, data provider, advertiser, agency to understand what's going on. We're now starting to see that you can resolve these things in minutes and not days, and that, I think, is where you can actually use applied AI in a practical way, and we're starting to see the impact of that already.
But it requires different companies to actually be building it out. The only way we're going to see proper agentic communication is every single player in the industry, in the ecosystem, is actually building that out, and that includes brands. So if brands and agencies are not building out their buying agents or their querying agents or potentially their own supply discovery agent then can link in through the MCP service to yourself, it's great that you have all that technology and all of that sort of native to your own platform. But I do think when it comes to like the mindset of, I wouldn't say it's a different mindset, but it comes back down to this sort of aspect of waiting for everything to be sort of set and the governance, etc. We're seeing markets really push ahead and break the boundaries. We're seeing a lot of third-party companies build out these agents and then provide them to agencies and brands in order for them to start to use. So if there's one piece of advice I'd give to the German market is seek those out. Take a look at those. Look at it from a brand perspective. Don't just expect the DSPs and the SSPs to be building stuff out. You as a brand and you as an agency should be looking at agentic as well.
Without a doubt. And I think that steps are happening, right? So we're starting to see things like the agentic real-time framework standards that actually these things can be built on. I guess kind of one of the things that bothers me a little bit is that the things that get the headlines aren't necessarily the things that are actually going to make any difference. Mm-hmm. So, yes, you can integrate into an MCP, but the reality is, ad CP on the advertiser side is not even connected in any regard to open RTB. So you can't do anything with it. It literally is not connected to it. And so, you hear all this noise. Most of it is just it's not applicable.
Well, hopefully that's going to change now. Prebid and IAB have got their fingers into it.
Yeah.
All right. We got 3 minutes, so I want to get on to our third and final topic, which is about new media. So, Emily, why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, I think the point of view that I was going to bring, given that I'm representing Uber here, is kind of the commerce media and retail media more broadly as well. And I sort of alluded to it earlier, where We're leaning very heavily as a business into IAB Europe and, kind of how we can help create standards around the best practices in doing these things, and kind of like really, really leaning in to kind of be at the forefront of building those out. Yeah.
The only thing I'd say about new media is just because it works in one market doesn't mean it works in another. So we've had instances of Yahoo is also a publisher, not just a DSP. We've had instances of high impact formats that work in one market that don't work in another. So I think that it kind of comes back to that test and learn scenario. Again, if you're starting to think about pushing out into other markets, take a look to see what's running. There's plenty of data that's out there, and don't assume that what works in one market is going to work in another.
Yeah, and you've talked about it, but CTV is just a fantastic example of where, a lot of what comes in the industry press does not come from Europe. And so often you're kind of led to believe that there's all this scale and it's so simple. And the reality is that every market is different. And yes, there are some similarities. I mean, I'd argue at least from a sort of a structural perspective, there are there's similarities between like the UK and the German market, but neither of them are anything like the US market. And so I just think you've got to be respectful of those things, and you've got to take them into account before, making decisions over how you're going to deploy, and just be careful about what you read.
Fully agree.
I'll throw out one thing. So what moved me to London 10 years ago is I worked for an agency called VaynerMedia that at that time was only in the US. So a guy named Gary Vaynerchuk that maybe some of you have heard of. And he used to say, attention is like a stock market. There are overpriced buys and there are underpriced buys, and it's changing all the time. And I think those stock markets are different by country and market as well. So the emerging channels in one market might be different than the emerging channels in another, and there might be underpriced attention in those markets. All right, we got to wrap it up. I'm sorry that we didn't get to more of these questions, but I am happy to stick around. I'm sure our panelists would be as well. There's some good ones in here. To close things out, can you each please give the one thing, if it had to be one thing for people to take away, think about, do differently, based on this conversation, what would it be? Alice?
Don't wait for the standards. Just start building and test.
John?
Yeah, curation is your friend, so I guess to continue the analogy, just buy more tailored suits.
Emily?
Experimentation, like lean into it. Other markets are doing it, and don't get left behind.
That's it. Thank you so much.